first of all, welcome everybody. Absolutely fantastic to see to interact with everybody here. At any point, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A. I have been teaching online for 12 years now, so I am very well versed in kind of looking at the presentation and looking at the Q&A chats and everything else at the same time. So we have some time together. Again, we want to maximize the time, and of course, we want to make sure that all the questions that you might have are answered. Okay, so let me just do a quick introduction first, and then thank you, Raj, graciously already mentioned several of the things here. I'm originally from Fortaleza, Brazil, so this is a picture of my hometown there. I actually have triple citizenship somehow. From Brazil, Italy, and in the US. Many solo travel experiences, work experience in consulting in industry. My main focus in the things I do is information systems, and as part of my academic, focus. And as Raj mentioned, I have taken students to lots of different parts of the world so far. I never get to go to Africa because I was supposed to take students to Ghana, but then that was in 2020 when things were not very favorable for traveling. So we ended up replacing our Ghana, study tour with international speaker series about Ghana and West Africa. So we got some people from Ghana, some people from Nigeria as well, and it has several discussions about development and business in that part of the world. In terms of things I usually do, I mean, Raj already mentioned a little bit about that, right? One little change is that I'm not with Kelley Direct anymore. I have moved to what's called the Kelley Executive Education Programs. So I, by the time I sent the short introduction to that Raj and I discussed about the introduction, things have changed a little bit in my side as well. I do a lot of presentations especially about AI automation. I have developed video cases for in Guatemala. As Raj said before, I have taken a lot of students to do international case competitions as well. So with that out of the way, I don't have a super long presentation, and again, that's part of the reason that I wanted to have some questions from you folks. But this is where I have been in Asia, right? And again, the main idea here is really to talk a little bit about different types of experiences, and we're going to focus a little bit in India and China. They are the bigger countries, right? But I also want to talk a little bit about Thailand and South Korea, and because I have been there with students, and really hopefully is going to give everybody this the range of experiences when you're talking about Asia, right? And that's, I think, one important takeaway for me is that depending on where you are in Asia, things can be very, very dramatically different, right? So if you are in this area here, right, of Asia, right, I never been there. I could not speak much about that part, so apologies for that non-inclusive there. I have been much more for the other parts, right, to this area around the from India, China, etc., right? So that's such a vast range of countries and experiences that you really kind of have to figure out how to kind of compartmentalize a little bit more the information, because each country, and I'm going to do some talking about different countries, specifically the four I'm indicating here, and they are pretty dramatically different, right? So there's some similarities, but there's some significant differences as well. So in terms, so I think one question that sometimes people ask me is, how did a Brazilian get to take away, visit all these countries and do business in these countries, right? And you know, why? Right? You are Brazilian, right? You know, why don't you take students to South America? And that was kind of an evolution from myself. I have taken students to Brazil, right? I have taken students to Mexico before, but the evolution to me was like I have always been fascinated with Asia, right? And I think there is so much to learn. It always felt to me a little bit, you know, coming from Brazil, you know, living in the US, always felt to me less explored in terms of its history and tradition and contributions to the world. And that's something that really was very passionate about, you know, learning more about Asia. So my objective when I go to these countries is really to prepare my students, right, to learn about different countries. So it's really to come up with frameworks, right, with ways in which they can categorize information, because they don't know where they're going to be in the future, right? I mean, I think many students, you know, might have an interest in, my students at least have an interest in education abroad, right, or careers abroad, but they don't necessarily know, you know, if they're going to go here or there, right? So to me, the important thing is how can we create a structure that allows people to learn, right, and apply the same structure to different countries so they can quickly adapt and categorize information, right? So the same frameworks that help you learn about a country, right, will also help the students as well. And the more you travel, of course, and I'm sure that you all know that, right, the more those cross-country comparisons are going to enrich the experience, right? So there are very subtle, you know, difference. You know, there's some similarities that you see. Oh, you know, we are in Asia. There's some expectations about behavior. Some of those are kind of stereotypes, to be frank, to be honest. But some of those are subtle, you know, differences, right? How Koreans, you know, look at you much more of a direct eye-to-eye contact that's not going to find as much in Thailand, right? So that's the kind of thing, like, right? To kind of keep building your knowledge and your body of knowledge, and you're able to categorize and say, hey, this is how this is similar, this is how it's different, right? And to me, I think the big thing has always been like, you know, really never stop learning. You know, just keep learning and keep understanding what's new and what's exciting, right? So let's go a little bit in terms of, you know, the overall topic of about Asia, and I'm going to do a little understatement here, which is Asia is big, right, and very diverse, right? So this is the part that I really want to specify again and again, right? You know, if you make a cross comparison, for example, you know, from let's say from, you know, let's say Japan, right? To let's see where I am in my little pointer here. Okay, now I see that. You know, if you can make a comparison between Japan and Turkey, right? And Turkey and India, right? And India versus Indonesia, right? You are going to see extremely diverse, you know, approaches, right, to life, to social structures, to religion, right? So this is something that I want to really highlight is the importance of Asia, right? And the differences between the countries is as dramatic as it can be, right? So of course we heard from Kelley SQ about Africa before, right? You heard from Erica Kovacs about South America, right? So there's of course some differences there, right? You know, especially in Africa when you have so many. It's a big continent, obviously, right? So many differences between East and Western Africa, between South Africa and the rest of the development that took place, you know, in different parts of Africa. These we're talking about, you know, almost a whole new level, right, in terms of differentiation between those different those countries, those cultures, those backgrounds, and so on and so forth. So, you know, but having said all that, right, we're still talking about 60% of the world population living in Asia, right? Some estimates from 2023 would indicate about 4 billion, almost 4.8 billion people, right, are going to be living there. And of course, you have the two most populous countries in the world are also there, right? So of course, in China, about 1.4 billion, and India about 1.4 billion. And India as you might know, has just recently overtaken China as the most populous, the highest population in the world, right? And of course, there's several implications about that in terms of economic growth, right? GDP growth and GDP penalties that China is going to be expected to pay a little bit in the future versus the very young population that we have in India right now, right? We also see some dramatic, dramatic role in terms of the overall economy, right? So if you think about nominal GDP for the regions, about 41 trillion, but once you put purchase parity power, power parity, then it goes to $79 trillion, right? So it's at least 40% to talk about nominal GDP, about close to half of the GDP in the world when you talk about the purchase power parity, right? But that's when you start to see some of the big differences, right? The economic differences, right? You start seeing, the GDP of China being close to $20 trillion, right? And the GDP of India being close to $4 trillion, right? Even though they have about the same population, right? So this is kind of the first sign about the diversity that you see in countries there. And of course, once you go to per capita GDP, that is when you see even more of the differences, right? You have, for example, Singapore and Qatar, right, which are really, really high GDPs, and of course per capita, right? And you have several other countries pretty much in the other extreme where poverty is unfortunately rampant, right? So that's the kind of thing that, again, I want you to really capture, right? It is this contrast that you see, in economic terms, social terms, religious terms, infrastructure, and so on and so forth, right? So let's talk a little bit about the similarities, however, right? And this is where we see a lot of those similarities also taking place. So this is from GlobeSmart, and I believe you might have access to GlobeSmart right now, but this is essentially, some of the 4 countries, and I'm specifying the countries where I have much more, knowledge and background in those countries, right? So I want to do a comparison in terms of some of the cultural similarities or differences that we have seen here, right? And what you're going to see is that, India, Thailand, Korea, South Korea, and China, right, in terms of their dimension for interdependence, right, very close together, right? We see the same, pretty much a very similar situation. Talk about, the concern about the status, right? You see very close here in between tasks and relationships, right? We see a little bit of difference here in terms of direct versus indirect, but all of them tend to be much more indirect, communication styles. And of course, we see a little bit more of a difference in terms of risk and certainty, right? How much you approach risk, right? How much you are able to deal with uncertainty, right? With certainty versus risk, right? So how much you like things to be very structured, very organized, and you avoid risk as much as possible. And that's probably the only difference, because you have the only more significant difference here, because of course you have China, a little bit more of an outlier in that dimension. So to me, this is a very interesting factor here, right? Because we have all these all these differences from backgrounds, from economic development, for our government systems, right? But culturally, there is still a lot of similarities, right, between those 4 countries, even though they have very different government structures, they have very different histories, right? And it is something that you have to acknowledge early on as well. Okay. So if you look in terms of, so I'm going to, if there are any questions about any of those things, just put that in the Q&A. If not, we just keep moving on, and I'm going to go over each of those countries in particular, just to examine some particular differences that you see. Okay, so let's a little bit to focus on China first, right? And I want to again capture, you know, kind of a, that's kind of one of the frameworks I tend to use a lot, right? The PESTEL framework, right? It stands to politics, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal factors. And I'm going to throw up a little demographics as well, right? So if you go back, if you really focus on China, so one thing that is important to notice, right? And I'm not going to issue any judgment about international politics or anything, but you know, there obviously I think you can always see there has been a much more tension between the U.S. and China in recent years, right? That has really led to increased distance between those two countries, right? So, for example, at Kelley right now, I took students to China several times, right, and visit many companies there. Mostly I went to Beijing, right, and I went to Shanghai as well. Occasionally I have been to Chengdu, right, and of course we Hong Kong as well, and so all these different regions, right, and right now would probably be very difficult there. What are the cultural similarities you find in Asia? A lot. Let me just go back a little bit here, right? So those dimensions that come from Global Smart, they're really spot on, right? So if you see, you know, there is a lot of risk aversion, right? There's a lot of, you know, you want to see, you know, it's hard to kind of equate that to initiative, right? In the sense of, you know, hey, if things are not going well, right, you tend to wait for certain permissions to solve problems. And we saw that in some consulting engagements we did there, where, you know, there is always kind of, okay, I'm waiting for someone to make a higher up to make a decision, right? That was what we saw quite a lot there, right? Indirect communication, that was very significant, right? In terms of not really providing very specific answers. And for example, I did several consulting projects with my students there, and one of the biggest things is that we could never figure out what the client was thinking, right? If you go to a client in the US, right, very likely if the client does not like it, right, what you're doing, the client's going to tell you right away, right? Like, nope, not appropriate or not acceptable, or good effort, not in the right, we should need to change the direction here. The biggest things that we saw there was we never get that feedback, right? So got to the point in which we had to adapt several of the follow-up questions for us. Things like never ask a question that can be answered yes or no. Like things like, do you like, right? Do you like what we present to you? Because the answer is going to be always yes. Like very rarely we found, like, you know, no. And that was in Thailand, that was in China, that was in India, right? That was the constant, right? This indirect, you know, discourse here. That was always the case that we saw super prevalent. And that, so essentially that led us to kind of alternate questions, like, you know, you have to think about options first, right? So instead of saying, do you like this option, right, you have to kind of say there are 5 options or 3 options or something in terms of what we can do for you. Which of those 3 options seems to fit you better, right? Because that would elicit a more direct answer. If you just say, this is an option, react to that, right? So that would be a problem, which could never get, you know, and occasionally led to people that were unhappy, but they were very afraid of hurting our feelings, right? They are very afraid about, you know, we're going to talk about the concept of face later on, right? So the concept of face in terms of not losing face, that was super prevalent, right? And in the 5 thing, the other thing is very relevant, right? That I saw this again and again, status orientation, right? Very much so. You know, I remember, you know, hanging out in teams, right, with my students, and go to visit the companies, and, you know, talking with the CEO of the company or some high level executive, right? And, you know, my approach is like, you know, my students are the stars of the whole event, right? So I tend to kind of go back and when take like a group picture, right? Cannot do that, right? I have to be in the front. I have to be shaking the hands of the leader of that particular organization, right? So there's a lot of very implicit and sometimes very explicit, you know, uh, um, reaction to status, right? I'm the faculty leader of my group, right? I'm the most important person in that group. You need to be close to the most important person in the company side as well, because that's how we're going to see that. And finally, relationship basis, right? Everything is relationship based, right? We're going to talk about different things. We're going to establish relationships, very, very network oriented. All countries are very network oriented, right? Kind of who you know, who should get you there, how are you going to, you know, get that information, how you get, you know, a visit or, you know, a discussion of a transaction or anything, right? Is all about the relationships that that we're forming. So that is something that are very common. So it's, you know, Global Smart. Occasionally, I find some things that are weird in Global Smart, right? But in terms of the social dimensions, I'm sorry, the cultural dimensions, it's actually pretty spot on. At least in my experience, I have seen those countries. Is that perfect? No, right? You go to a different country with a different background, different origin, right? There may be some exceptions to the rule, right? But for the most part, you know, those cultural dimensions actually are pretty nicely done. Okay, so I hope I have answered the question. But, you know, let me know if you have additional follow-ups that I'd like to do. Okay. So going back to and thank you, Franklin, for the question, by the way. So think about demographics in China, right? So they're different, of course, they're different groups. So China is you know, Han Chinese are the biggest group right now, but there are several subgroups. And again, I'm not going to go into, you know, of course, if you go to this area of the country, let's see, where am I here? I'm making sure that I'm not losing my, right? If you go to more for this area of the country, you know, the west side of the country, northern side, right, you're going to see several significant issues, right, with tolerance of minorities, and we have seen those in the news in the US, so we have to be aware of that, right? So most of the population is going to be concentrated on the coast in China, right? So this is something that you're going to see quite a bit. Chengdu, if you like pandas, that's the place to be. Chengdu is considered the kind of the capital of the West, even though there's a lot of West beyond Chengdu, right? But a lot of those areas here are much more sparsely inhabited, right? So that's a big metropolis that you see in Chengdu. Beautiful city, super modern, Panda Research Center there. But most of the city are going. So there's really this big contrast between east and west in China, and big contrasts between northern and southern parts. Right, southern parts, you know, Beijing being more the northern part of the country is considered to be much more bureaucratic, much more, you know, things have to be much more rule following, right? Versus the southern part. If you go to Guangzhou, right, for example, one of the things you hear, it would be like, you know, yeah, you know, if the people in the north do not really, you know about that, that's probably okay, right? So there's a much more of less rule, you know, maybe not rule breaking, but a little bit less of a version of a lot of bureaucracy that you see more in the southern part of China versus the northern part of China, you know, and Shanghai kind of sits in the middle, so it has a little bit of characteristics of both parts. Of course, I'm not going to discuss a lot about politics, but big concerns right now, right? So that's one of the things that, you know, for example, at Kelley, you know, right now would be tough to take a group to China, right? It's one of the countries that would have to think, you know, multiple times about going now. So it's unfortunate because it's really, you know, so many there's so many wonderful things happening in China as well, right? In terms, I mean, of course, we have some severe issues in the economy right now, right? The one-child policy really led to this population gap in terms of growth, right? As you know, a younger population, right, creates a bonus in the growth of GDP, right, growth of the richness of the country, and China is losing that, right, because after many decades of one-child policy, right? They finally opened up the rules recently, but there is not much. They're still super expensive to live in cities, right? If you go to Shanghai, if you go, even though the real estate situation in China is a mess right now, it's too expensive, right? So getting married, right, having multiple kids, that's complicated, right? So these economy issues that China is facing right now, with not much consumer expenses, right? A lot of investment in real estate, but not secure, not with enough leverage. So there's a lot of things happening right now in China. So we saw all that 12%, 10%, 14% of growth, right, that China experienced in the last 2 decades for the most part, right? And now we are in this very turbulent period that we just don't know what is going to happen with China from an economic perspective, right? So this is something that is big concerns, right? Because a lot of Western economies are trying to decouple from China, right, in terms of manufacturing facilities and so on and so forth. So we don't quite know where this is going. So it's an interesting focal country for you to study, but there are several limitations in terms of what you might be able to see as a permanent status or versus just a more of the turbulence. Okay, if you look at social, right? So interesting enough, so one of the things to me that's interesting is that, and kind of a social economic as well, is that the Gini index, right? So the measure of inequality in China is actually bigger than the US, right? And it's partly because most of the people who live in the cities, that's where a lot of the richness are concentrated, versus if we start looking at the western part of China, the rural part of China, right? That's when the income levels are pretty low, right? China also still has some control about where you can live, where you can work. There's a very stratified university system in terms of admission for universities. So there is a lot of interesting things happening in terms of when the economy is growing 10%, 12% per year, right? I mean, that's not really, we'll handle that because everybody's getting better off, right? When the economy is stagnating a little bit more, right, it's interesting to see what's happening in terms of the economic and social issues that you have, right? One quick thing about China that I always fascinating to this, like 91% of the Chinese people do not have any religion, right? So this is a very, society that does not necessarily have a lot of presence of organized religion there, right? So again, it's part of the social fabric as well, of course. Technological aspects, I have never seen as many cranes as I have seen in China, right? There's always building stuff. There's always, I took this high-speed train from Beijing to, actually from Shanghai to Beijing. It is absolutely wonderful, work of engineering, super fast, super efficient, and everything in China is built very quickly, right? So that's, I guess, there is not really much of a resource from the population that says, well, there'll be a high-speed train line going through here, and this for the betterment of our economy. We don't really have many resources to oppose that, right? Once there's a determination from the government. But technologically, China is one of the biggest leaders in AI, right? Is one of the biggest leaders in machine learning. Quantum computing is where most of the investment in the world is actually done in China, right? So this is a country that, again, of course, the economic situation right now might change that, but this is a country that has invested very, very heavily in technology, and in really not only technology, but kind of kind of technology, kind of advanced technology as well, right? So the fruits of their investment are probably going to be felt in several different ways in the next decades. Environmental. So this is an interesting thing about environment in China, right? Because there's a lot of pollution, right? So we sometimes you go to Beijing, right, and you see these beautiful blue skies, and they refer to the blue skies as Olympic blue, because during the Olympics, you might remember 2008, they closed all the factories around Beijing, right? So I happened to be there in China for one of the Belt and Road meetings, and all the international leaders were there. So all the factories were closed for that time, and so beautiful blue skies, right? Of course, it's not reality for most of the time in China. It can be polluted, but it's also the country where it has the highest investment in solar power. Is one of the highest investments in wind power. Is one of the biggest market by far of electric vehicles, right? You cannot get a license plate right now if you're buying a combustion engine car. You can get one if you buy a hybrid, and more likely an EV car, right? Huge investments. Whole cities are now served by electric buses, right? So, so at the same time, there's a lot of pollution because it's still coal, burning. There is a lot of huge amount of investment in environment technologies, and I'll probably say that it's probably a leader in many of those technologies worldwide, right? And because again, if you produce so much, you have such a big market internally, right? The costs go very low, and you are able to export really low costs, right? So that's something that is very, very prevalent. So it's interesting because sometimes, if you are in the US, China pollutes a lot, and it's true, right? But most of the coal, the thermoelectric, the power plants that you have in the US that uses coal would not operate in China, right? They would not be able to allow to operate in China, just because there are many more restrictions in terms of pollution right now than there are even in the US, right? So there's a very nuanced story when you talked about environmental issues in China, where it's a lot of pollution, but there's very strong actions to counter that, right? And of course, this because it's pesto, right? So legal in China is complicated. Put this way. Interesting enough, another interesting thing that sometimes are misconceptions, right? Is a very robust IP legal system there, right? It is just that it's very hard to actually implement the laws, right? China has produced a lot of patents, right? Has reached a lot of patents worldwide. Many, on par with the US, with the the European Union. It's just the enforcement of those policies at times, especially from foreign goods. It's hard, right? And we see this again and again. When there's this big show of we're closing this illegal factory of counterfeit goods, right? Coal, right? Well, a couple of days later, there will be another plant almost to the side of the original one, because again, the enforcement, right, and it's not quite there. Okay, so again, please feel free to ask. I'm going to do like this potpourri of different countries because they are so different, and I again want to capture that idea, that what makes them different as well, right? India, right? Demographics in India, a gigantic country, very, very diverse, socially, in terms of, so you see New Delhi, right, on the top here, right? If you see, Kashmir around here, right? You see Amritsar right here, which is the Punjab, right? So you see all these different areas, and they are extremely diverse, right? So, for example, let's see, if you look at Mumbai, right, Pune, if you go back here to places like Chennai, I mean, all those are almost, I mean, they were, right, almost very completely different countries, right? And if you go to the south, you're going to see things like Kerala, right, which is actually for example, there's a lot of Catholicism in Kerala, right, which is not the case for the rest of India, right? Where Kerala is a state that it's meat without many concerns, which is not the situation that you see in most of India, right? So again, it is very hard to create like kind of a mental map of demographics in India, because those different those are different kingdoms, right? They with different there are different terms for maharajas and so on and so forth that essentially were kind of annexed by, of course, when the British came. But there is a lot of a diversity, and again, this kind of thing that you want to see, right? So if you go to Lucknow, right? If you go to Calcutta, those, it's a very different India than if you go to Mumbai, and if you go to Delhi, right? If you go to Bengaluru, right? Or if you go to Amritsar, right? So that is the kind of thing that, again, we want you to keep in mind very much, in India, right? In different, gorgeous country, absolutely, right? But this diversity is extremely important, right? So think about politics in India. So we have Narendra Modi right now with a very nationalistic agenda, right? Modi has really transformed a lot of the politics in the country. So it's something that you want to be very aware about what is happening. And again, I want to avoid as much as possible to take a big position here. But some things in India, that was a very distinct separation between the state and religion, that is starting to unfortunately get much more mixed there, right? If you look at India, has always been a very secular place, right, government. And unfortunately, there's a lot of mixed messages between Hinduism and nationalism now in India, that the government has advanced quite a bit in the last years, right? It's a very, very active government. I mean, Modi has been really very masterful in creating a very big base of support. But to be fair, there's also this manipulation of nationalist sentiment and religion as well, right? So you see much more conflict, right? That was not to say it didn't exist, right? You might remember the partition in India, right? When Bangladesh and Pakistan, right? That was obviously a super traumatic experience for countries where people had to mass migrate, right, to go to where their religions would be more accepted. But now we see a little bit of a resurgence of much more of a focus on nationalism and politics that are there. So again, from a business perspective, the government is much more business oriented, right? For the longest time, India had a very socialist oriented economy. Was essentially a disaster, right? India essentially went in bankrupt back in the 80s. So it is something, but so it's a much more, focus on business now. And I think there's an interesting policies, right? That is happening. It's just that there is also there's also other parts that might be more negative, right? Economically, so this is the interesting. India is an interesting country because it's a country that still has a lot of people, contrary to perhaps many other Asian countries. A lot of people in India still work in rural areas, right? They still look at the primary sectors as the way they get their subsistence, right? That revenue, their income. But there are very different ways in which agriculture is implemented in India, right? So if you go to Dharamshala, which is in the northern part of the country, close to the Himalayas, you're going to see very small plots of land, right? This is people are farmers, but they farm in very small plots of land, right? If you go to the Punjab, just driving through the Punjab, you can see essentially farms that look like Midwestern farms in the US, right? Huge areas, very flat, right, with more mechanized agriculture, right? So very different, economic, perspective. So India is expected, because of the young population, right? India is expected to keep growing quite a bit, and the growth in India has been, of course, COVID disrupted that, but the growth in India has been very, very strong over the last years. It's expected to remain strong for many years to come because the population is so young, right? There's still huge inequality, right? You see literally apartment buildings that are owned by some of the richest men in the world that are worth $1 billion. And I'm not kidding about the number. It's $1 billion apartment building with, hundreds of employees, right, to cater to every single need of this family, and you look from the apartment building, you can actually see, slums, right? So huge inequality, contrary to China, when there's a little bit more control in terms of population migration, that is known in India, right? So that is something that you see a lot of migration from the rural areas to the cities. Like, I remember one of the projects when I was involved with an NGO in Dharamshala was how to stop that. So they were asking us about how to stop migration, how to stop people leaving their farms and going to the cities. And it was like, there is nothing we can do here, right? It's just economic pressure where people believe there are opportunities in cities, and that's how they're migrating to the cities, right? Unfortunately, the cities are not really able to support this intake of people, right? Socially, right, we talk about an inequality, very, very distinct. So of course, you also have to remember there is still some remnants of the caste system in India, right? It's not overt, but the issue exists. You see some signs from time to time about that. There is a lot of effort from the government perspective to give the what used to be the untouchables, right? The lowest caste more opportunities that have been denied to them. So think about what in the US would be affirmative action, right? Perhaps to some certain degree of affirmative action. So that is the same approach in India, especially related to castes that were neglected or groups that were neglected in the past, and do not really have access to any kind of a social benefits of being the more powerful groups. So so school, spots reserved for members of certain castes, right, or groups, or employment in government reserved to those, right? So that is a very conscious effort to try to equalize a little bit the conditions of people who were essentially underserved for so many years, right? Technology in India is fascinating because this is a country that so if you think about technology, right, it's one of the most active countries, fantastic infrastructure, of course the best. Some of the best technology minds are from India, right? I remember going to Microsoft conferences where the people would have their Indian Institute of Technology. There's, I believe, 6 of them, maybe more now. I don't remember exactly. They would have their own groups, affinity groups, because there's so many people that come from the top schools in India, right? But still a big gap in infrastructure, right? Still big gaps, and for the service part, for the computing and technology part, super modern, right? Different parts of the infrastructure not quite there, right? So agriculture, main parts of India are not super productive, right? You see the train system. You might have seen a couple of months ago some train crashes. Actually, they are very common in India, unfortunately, right? Because there is not much of an investment in railways. It's getting better. There is more investment now, but it's still a lot to do. Roads can be hit or miss. If you go from Agra to Delhi, fantastic road. If I have been in India from Bengaluru to Mysore, which it looks in a map like, wow, it's like 70 miles or so, maybe 60 miles or so. I can't remember exactly. And then the estimate of Google was 2 hours and a half. Like, why? Why is 2 hours and a half? Well, because the modern road had just been inaugurated a couple of years ago, just cannot support that traffic and the amount of infrastructure that is not quite there, right? So fantastic, some fantastic in some ways. Really, that's probably the biggest gaps you have seen in the whole world, right? Environmental issues. India is, if you see in terms of pollution in cities, unfortunately, is some of the most polluted cities in the world are in India right now, especially if you get there around March and April, right? Especially if you land in Delhi, you are going to feel that right away, right? Lots of wind. There's a lot of wood burning to cook. And some really big swaths of deforestation, unfortunately. So you feel that in cities. Really, has become, unfortunately, a big health issue in India right now. Is how to decrease, right, the pollution in a way that we're able to really come up and get some really good health for everybody, right? That's the air pollution is a big problem. Legal system in India is very organized, very structured. Multiple chambers, multiple levels. It's just slow. So one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that if you ever get into a legal scenario in India, it might take many years to get the case solved. I'm from Brazil, so it's pretty much like what Brazil is. So it's a little bit familiar in that regard. Very quickly, because we only have about 12 minutes. Thailand, very different, right? Different demographics, different politics. King, right? Very influential figure, right? Is a prime minister. We have some coups from time to time in Thailand, so be alert of that. There's a lot of instability at times in the country, where the military take power and then they eventually leave the power, then they eventually take over the power again. We have been caught at times in Thailand not being able to leave the country because protesters were taking over the airport. So our groups had to actually go and with the Kelley network, we're able to find our way to different parts of Thailand. Then take a flight to Malaysia to San Francisco to Indianapolis. So that's very different. Very strong economy, right? Social issues. Some disparity, of course, some inequality. It's a very much more of a Buddhist country, right? With a little percentage of Muslims. Strong technology. It's one of the biggest countries. Might surprise people. One of the biggest countries for environmental protections and environmental concerns, right? There's a countrywide strategy to move Thailand to the forefront of green economy, right? To really this a lot of emphasis in recycling, a lot of emphasis on garbage. Is it working perfectly right now? No, we can see signs of things that could be better, but it really has become a countrywide focus on those issues there. Again, very quickly, Korea, and again, just to give you like a range, right? You see India, China, Thailand. Korea, demographics, very homogeneous population, right? Very much, most of the Koreans are from Korea, right? Korea has an interesting story. There's so many wars, so many occupations of Korea from China. Of course, just before the Second Great War, Korea was occupied by Japan, which was a devastating period for the country. Sorry? Oh, devastating part for the country. And what you see right now is really, I don't know if you remember this, but a couple of weeks ago, we have kind of a rapprochement between the Korean Prime Minister and the Japanese Prime Minister with going to meet with President Biden here. That is a big step, right? Because they show a huge, even today, there is still kind of some resentment, right? Because the population that were alive at that point, right, are still alive, right? They're still here. There are fewer of them, of course, but they should remember how Japan was absolutely ruthless, right? And we should have Japan never apologize to Korea. They should mothers, right, or actually not mothers, but people who were sex slaves during the occupation of Korea by Japan that should protest today to have some kind of recognition about what Japan did, right? Economic, one of the miracles in the world, right? Actually, you might refer a miracle on the river Han is that's Korea, right? A country that essentially in the 50s after the Korean War, politics is one of the jewels of Asia in terms of democracy, right? And I have heard people referring that if the US has any kind of a prize, in terms of the influence in the world, in terms of, fomenting democracy, that is Korea, right? Huge influence of the US, is still a big partner, but, it's kind of probably like the model, right, in terms of US influence for the good if it comes to democracy, right? That is countries alternate power, right? From time to time, the elections are there's a lot of participation, a lot of they're clean, they're well run, and there's transition of powers. Absolutely no issue. Maybe we should learn something from Korea in terms of transition of power. So economic issues are again a miracle, right? Korea last in the 50s. The per capita GDP was equivalent to Haiti, right? I remember that in the 80s, right, Korea, Brazil were kind of about in the same level of development, right? And all of a sudden, Korea just took off, right? It's a very unique system in which certain families were selected to run certain companies in close collaboration with the government, and this family, in a little bit of a network of corruption as well. But the whole country was lifted, right? So all the things that you sometimes say, don't do this, a very plain economy, right? Oligarchy in general. So all the things say that is bad in general, but in Korea it kind of works. So highly invite everybody to explore a little bit more Korea. Is a fascinating social experience, economic experience. Socially, 60% no religion, 17% Christians because of the high influence of the US, right? And 16% of Buddhists, right? It is a country that's a huge amount of pressure in the younger population. It's the lowest fertility rate in the world. This is a country that's getting old very quickly, right? And there's a lot of things the government is trying to address. It's just that not really have much success so far. The fertility rate of Korea about 0.83%, right? So we're not really replacing, people are just getting old. No incentives to get married. The government is paying something, right? Give some incentives, but it's not enough, right? So very interesting transformations happening in Korea right now in terms of how it's going to sustain that growth over time. Employment for a lot of people, top employment, not so many, right? So it's a brutal, absolutely brutal, right? Competition to get in the top 3 universities, right? They call it SKY. Seoul, Yangwon, and Korea in Seoul. So that is you see stories of Korea, of Korean students having to, go to school and essentially work until midnight, and they are real, right? So I talking with my students in Korea, with my students that are from Korea, right? And we talk about that all the time. It's just a brutal competition. Technology, fantastic country, a lot of innovation. That's the country I go for innovation right now in a variety of different areas. Technology is just one of them, right? The culture of Bali, everything is fast. They're super agile. I remember like Domino saying, hey, we can just drop the pin and we're going to deliver anything for you, whatever you are, right? You have seen that ads on TV, perhaps, and Domino Pizza, I believe is Domino. And Korea has had that for so long. It's like, really, that's the innovation you're kind of proposing right now? That's pretty much what people have been doing in Korea for years now, right? Interesting concerns environment. So much more. Korea is very focused on measuring things, right? So there's a lot of smart city issues there. In terms of actually implementations there, in terms of like measuring garbage, right? So one of the things that we learned the hard way is that there's no garbage cans anywhere in Seoul, right? because you are supposed to produce your own garbage and keep care of your own garbage essentially at home or in the office, and you pay for that, right? To minimize the production of garbage. So people were essentially trying to get around that by dumping garbage in like public garbage cans, and essentially the solution was take away all the garbage cans. So if you ever, do as we do in the US, in kind of a, get food to eat with you, you are going to carry that wrap for a while. Let's put it this way, right? So environmental issues are addressed there. So they're trying to address. There's still a lot of effort to be done, but much more to come. Just to wrap, couple things, kind of recommendations if you want to do business, or if you want to apply your knowledge to a particular country, right? One of the first things I'll do, decide your focus, right? So for example, for China, for me, has always been infrastructure, right? It's a country to get infrastructure, it's a country to really figure out how things can evolve very quickly, how things get done, really public infrastructure, smart cities, really great place to go. India, to me, has always been like global business, right? And eventually social evolution, socioeconomic evolution in contrast. How can you visualize an integrated Korea, right? It's a great question. So, it depends on who you ask, right? If you ask this right now to the younger Koreans, they couldn't care less, right? It's like, why? We have never lived in an integrated Korea, right? The older people have the vision because part of the family, right? Of course, I should separate it, right? There's several things we can talk about that beyond this, but family that should separate. So the older generation still feels, right? Well, we want to reintegrate, right? And we don't know how this is going to be, of course, right? There's hope. There's some kind of a thawing of the relationships, and then things happen again. They separate again, right? So that's the dance has been dance for a while. But if you ask the younger generation, they couldn't care less, and they say, who is going to pay for this, right? We have this country north of us, which is completely backwards, right? Except of course for weapons industry, it seems. It's going to cost a lot to absorb them, right? And the time, right, is already pretty much from the Korean War, right? You're talking about 70 years. So the younger generation, if you ask them, and we did, we kind of we explored that as well in the time in Korea. They're like, I don't. We don't care about that. So it's hard to visualize an integrated Korea, and that's something really dramatically changes, right? Or there's a crisis that forces people to integrate, like completely, I don't know exactly what the crisis to be, but it's not quite the situation like Eastern Europe and Western Europe, right? Because that was much more recent. Right? At this point, it really takes a lot of time, and there's just not, for the younger generation, not enough memory to think about reintegrating Korea. They just like, yeah, they are there, we are here, we're doing fine, they are doing whatever they're doing there. So I mean, I sound a little bit callous, but that's pretty much what the answers we have received there when they ask this question to people. So India, global business, Thailand, environmental issues and solutions to be one of the best places to understand it. And Korea to me is innovation in so many different aspects, right? So many different things that are there. Okay. So we did that as well. So one of the things that I always recommend if you're going to be doing a class or doing some consulting projects or visiting a country for business, right? To me, understanding your focal country is very important, right? And I know I'm a little bit on time here because I think it's supposed to go into 12:10 for the Q&A. If you allow me 5 minutes, I'll finish this part and then can have the rest for Q&A. Global Smart, Global Edge, economic and social data. One of the things I do in my classes is I show charts for the students. We talked about some issues before. I show charts to my students and essentially say, hey, what do you conclude about these charts, right? What do you conclude in terms of, if you think about India, different, primary, secondary, tertiary participation, right? What are the things that you see? So I just show the chart to them and let them start thinking about telling a story about the chart, right? And of course, then I verify, yeah, that's a good assumption. That's not a great assumption. And so just getting to know that that is great, right? Of course, books, culture, history, economics. to me are just a resource that is a must, right, in terms of understanding. I have learned a lot about Korea in recent times. It just reading about that, of course. One of the things interesting about movies and any sort of other artistic manifestations, right, painting, sculpture, and things like that. One of the things I learned about my students, just sharing that with you, they love movie recommendations. So I actually create a list of top Korean movies, right, that I like, right, essentially from Parasite to Old Boy, to Villainess, to Train to Busan, right, to The Wailing. So all these different movies, I say, hey, take a look at this, you might enjoy. To what's the Handmaiden as well. So there's a couple for Korea. I do the same thing for China, for India, although Bollywood is not my big thing. And I do that for China as well. I used to do that for China as well, like a big fan of Chen Kaiji and Zhang Yimou movies. So kind of giving them that the sense of the aesthetics, right? The sense of culture is so good. And to me, another thing I always do is pick a framework, right? And everything I look around and say, hey, this is how it fits in this framework. So I try to organize information among myself. If you're going to do business in Korea or China or India or any part of Asia, time zone differences are really make a little bit complicated to make any arrangements. If you are working China or Korea, it actually works well because 12 hours, right? So we kind of have meetings, day and time as long as people adjust. India is the complicated one, has always been complicated to schedule things. In part is because they have an hour they have, so you never really completely understand the time zone differences in India. So again, just be aware of that differences. So if you're scheduling meetings, making arrangements, it's always a little bit more complicated. If you're traveling to the country, right, I always consider traffic is always going to be worse than expected. If you're taking a group in a bus, for example, I learned in Korea, like bus, just take us to the subway station and we go from there, because it doesn't work. There is rallies almost every week in Seoul. People are protesting, peacefully protesting, right? They're protesting all the time, so the traffic gets congested. So take us to the subway station. We go from there, right? Same thing in Beijing as well, in Shanghai. That has always been like, as long as you can understand the subway is fine. It's most important. Same thing in Bangkok as well. Always subway station is the best. Arrangements will take extra time and decisions not be immediate. So anytime you make some arrangements with local people, it's going to take some extra time, right? Because many cases in my head, what's the right person to answer this question? Do I have authorization to answer this question? Don't I have that? Can I, if I'm hired with a higher up, this higher up is going to offload that to a subordinate, which might offload that to another subordinate. So every time we schedule things in China, it's almost like, let's give us a 2-month period to do that. And sometimes I have literally gone to China not knowing my itinerary fully, because things were still being arranged as I was there, right? So this is how much time it takes, right? Reserve some time for jet lag, visiting, and if possible, always have a great guide. It's usually a good recommendation in general. Cultural difference, that's one thing I want to mention. We talked a lot about that before. Thank you to Franklin's question, I appreciate that. Concept of face, saving face, is extremely important, right? So if you think about, say, a face, like, so the admission of a mistake, right? Or being put someone on the spot for making a mistake, that is devastating, right? People are going to lose trust on you, right? I have been to visits in China where I was supposed to go to a place, and then we went to a different place because the first place fell through, and then someone arranged a replacement the last minute, right? Was never explained to us what happened. It was just like, pretend that there's nothing unusual here, right? Just carry on and don't make any mention, because the person who made the original arrangement would feel very, very ashamed of that, right? So face is something important. Again, I cannot emphasize enough how important face, the concept of saving face is, right? We talked a little bit about, one thing we did not talk about, gender inequality. It's still significant in many of those countries. If you go to India, is still very significant in terms of what's expected from men and women. Same thing from Korea, a little bit of that in Thailand, a little bit less actually in Thailand. China is a little bit more egalitarian actually, but gender inequality, for example, in Korea is one of the big issues about the birth rate, is because women would expect it to have careers and essentially take care of all the house as well, right? With no essential help. So it's like, what's in it for me? And it makes no sense. So weddings have just dropped quite a lot, and with that, right, we still have not much in terms of fertility rate, because no weddings, and again, it's more conservative country, so no weddings, no babies, and that's what's happening right now in Korea, for example. And that is my last part.